Okay, everyone, I'd like to call this meeting to order. My name is Antonio Martinez, President of the Governing Board for the San Isidro School District. I want to welcome everyone to our special board meeting tonight. And I'd like to call this meeting to order at 5 p.m. I'd like to ask that all members of the board to mute their devices at this time. Trustees of the San Isidro School District Board and the public shall participate in this meeting via teleconference. The public may view the open session part of this meeting by accessing the YouTube link provided on the agenda. To listen to this meeting in Spanish, please call 440-673-3684 and enter the access code 837-617-104#. Para escuchar esta junta en español, por favor, llame al 440-673-3684 y ingrese el código de acceso 837-617-104 signo de gato. Members of the public are welcome to record this meeting using their own personal devices. Prior to roll call, I would like to make clear for the record of this meeting, and it should be reflected in the minutes, that this governing board meeting is conducted pursuant to Governor Newsom's Executive Order N-29-20. And we're going to move on to roll call. So Dr. Potter, as our secretary and our superintendent, can you please conduct the roll call vote, the roll call for attendance, please?
Thank you, Mr. President. Conducting agenda item number 2, roll call. Mrs. Irene Lopez, our board member, is absent this evening due to an urgent family matter. Board member Humberto Germilan.
Here.
Thank you. Our board clerk also may be absent or in and out of this meeting at this time. I do believe she's not here with us. She also has a unexpected family matter that she's addressing as well. Board Vice President Rudy Lopez.
Here.
Thank you, Mr. Lopez. And Board President Antonio Martinez.
Present.
Thank you, Mr. President. You do have a quorum of 3.
Thank you, Dr. Potter. I would now like to request that each board member respond to the following questions. We're going to start with board member Humberto Gurmilan. Mr. Gurmilan, can you hear me well?
Okay.
Were you able to hear our proceedings on this end until now?
I could.
And do you have a copy of the agenda for this meeting?
I do. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gurmilan. Vice President Rudy Lopez, can you hear me now?
I can.
Were you able to hear our proceedings on this end until now?
I could.
And do you have a copy of the agenda for this meeting?
I do.
Perfect. On that note, we're going to move on to the flag salute. Please join me in the flag salute. We'll be displaying the flag, picture of the flag on the screen. I would ask that those in the meeting, including other board members, to please mute to avoid feedback during the salute. And it'd be my honor to lead everyone in the flag salute. Right hand over your heart. Ready? Begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. That note, we're going to move on to the agenda. Do I have a motion to approve the agenda for this meeting?
So moved.
We have a second? Okay, I'll second that. So we have a motion by Mr. Lopez, and I'll be seconding the agenda. Dr. Potter, can you lead us in a roll call vote, please?
Thank you, Mr. President. Calling for the roll call vote for agenda item number 4, beginning with board member Humberto Germilan.
I think you might be muted, Mr. Germilan.
Yeah, sorry, I'm having trouble with the mouse, but aye.
Thank you. Board Vice President Rudy Lopez.
Aye.
Thank you. Board President Antonio Martinez.
Yes.
Thank you. The vote passes 3-0.
Thank you, Dr. Potter. We're going to move on to public comment communications on open session items. Do we have any communications for open session items this evening?
Mr. President, we do not have any public comment for the open session.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mata. And on that note, we're going to move on to General Administration 6.1, which is Board Governance Workshop. So at this point, we're going to be reviewing the following topics. Second review, Draft Facilities Master Plan and First Draft Implementation Plan. Number 2, presentation regarding school construction procurement methods and overview of project labor agreements by BBK. And presentation proposed updated district technology plan, July 2021 to June 2024 by our Director of Education Technology, Todd Lewis. And on that note, I'll Dr. Potter, if you want to take over.
Thank you so much, Mr. President. We're grateful to have a few experts in the room with us this evening during our special board meeting board workshop, primarily focused on the long-range master facility plan. And with that said, one of our goals this evening is to make sure to receive any feedback from our governing board members regarding the draft long-range master facility plan, so that when staff brings the plan back to the governing board at their regular board meeting on Thursday, June 24th, that we've had an opportunity to make any revisions that the board may seem fit to amend the current draft. So with that said, we also have a couple topics that we'll cover to better understand school construction procurement methods from our district's legal counsel from the Go Bonds, Tyree Dorwood, and also to provide an overview of the project labor agreement methods. And then from our very own Director of Technology to give us a proposed update on the district technology plan, particularly as it applies to our future work with our general obligation bonds. So with that said, I will turn it over to our Chief Business Official, Marilyn Adriansen.
Thank you. Good evening, Board President Martinez, Mr. Martinez, Governing Board, Dr. Potter, and community. Our first presentation will be provided by our President, Jim DiCamillo. Mr. DiCamillo is the WLC Architect President. This is our second review of the draft facilities master plan and a first look at an implementation plan. Mr. DiCamillo?
Good evening, everybody. Good to be back in San Ysidro. Again, I'm Jim DiCamillo with WLC Architects, and many of you have seen me present many times in the past. The last time I was together and presented to the board, we were looking at what we call the draft master plan, and for the board, you want to think of this essentially, like your budgetary review, in which you'll do a first reading, make any amendments, maybe do a second reading, and finalize your budget. This is very similar to that. It's a lot of information and a lot of strategic planning, so it's not unusual if there are some tweaks that would want to be looked at. This evening's presentation was originally conceived as more of a workshop, to be totally honest. It was an idea. I've always done this in person, and Marilyn and I kind of played with it a week ago virtually, and it worked pretty well, but I've simplified it even down further, and I'm gonna back into this by looking first at the implementation plan, and in that way I hope to make more sense of the facility master plan. To remind the board, your implementation plan is really kind of your roadmap through the projects that have been outlined in the facility master plan. It is essentially the recipe that says, I'm going to first do this, then I'm going to do that, then I'm going to stir the thing, then I'm going to pour it in a bowl, then I'm going to put it in the oven. That's the implementation plan. The master plan is not, and it's separate from the master plan. The master plan doesn't really speak to an order in which you're going to do things. It just gives the full universe of projects that you're going to do. But the implementation plan adds another layer. Not only does it add the layer of time, but it adds the layer of compartmentalization that the board must be aware of as you move forward. And I broached this subject when I presented the draft master plan. So I'm going to share my screen and then go into it. And I'm hoping I'm going to be able to share my screen by host disabled. So somebody controls the screen if you would allow me to do a screen share. I don't know if that's Mr. Mata or who. Yeah, there we go. So share. So hopefully you can see that screen should pop up in front of you. Yes, somebody give me a thumbs up or a nod of a head. Okay, so this is the presentation that we saw last time, and I am not going to go through the whole thing because we're on a limited time, but you'll remember this entire series of slides going all the way down, and maybe you can even see my border, which started with the various projects in the project list. What I want to focus on this evening is this next section, which is the development of the implementation plan. So I think it's a different way of looking at the project list because you quickly understand, and I showed this slide last time as basically a cartoon of an implementation plan. This is not an implementation plan. It was just to broach the subject of the implementation plan to get you comfortable with the topic. And the key things that I spoke about in that meeting, these colors and things really don't mean much other than that they were to try and give you the hint that you're going to have to compartmentalize your project list and fit them into these columns, what I have deemed sort of United Way thermometers. If you've ever watched a fundraiser at a corner, you know, in which they're slowly filling up the thermometers, it's towards a fundraising goal. This is very true in master planning and bond programs. You don't get all of the money all at one time. You sell bonds in tranches or increments or bond sales. So for this example, and I'm not your bond counsel or finance bank, but typically most bond programs are broken up into 4 bond sales. And for lack of a better, it all has to do with your assessed value and when those come due. What I have explained in the past is that while the public gave the board the authority to fund Measure T and U, it did not, the board does not have the ability, or the district does not have the ability to fund the entire twin bond measures all at one time. You don't qualify for a mortgage that large in one sitting. So you bite it off in segments. And as the staff says, we have now depleted the first column, they will come back to you as a board and ask you to either vote yay or nay on selling the next tranche of bonds. That does not go back to the public. That is a vote that's done by the board from the dais. And so you can choose to sell the next bonds. You can choose to pump the brakes and say something's happened in the world. I don't know what could happen beyond a pandemic, but something's happened in the world, and we want to hang on for 3 months before we sell the next series of bonds, or 3 years, or whatever. There is a criteria, and again, I'm sure you've been given some tutorials on this. There is a criteria that says that once you do sell those bonds, you must enact start the projects within a certain relatively short period of time. In other words, you can't hold this money in the bank and just earn interest on it forever. Once you've told the public you're selling the bonds, you have to do the projects. Why do I go into all that? Because the next thing you do then is develop an implementation plan that looks at this and says, how do we want to do these projects? And remembering that it's somewhat of a game. You're trying to fit projects within each one of those 4 United Way thermometers. You're trying to complete projects within them. So they have to fit within the thermometer, or they have to spill out and bridge into the next sale of bonds. Now, to make it maybe more clear in layperson's terms, there are certain projects that can span over bond sales. Projects that would be long, individual projects at individual sites, maybe projects that run across the whole district. Those could be, separated by project or by campus. But there are other projects that can't be. So for example, if you're going to build a new building, you can't build half a new building and wait for the next bond sale to finish it. The building would only be 8 feet tall and it wouldn't have a roof. So you want to make sure that if you're going to build a new building, it must fit completely within one of the 4 thermometers. Make sense? And that way you are not having to wait on a future bond sale of a future board, maybe all of you, or maybe some of you won't be on the board anymore, then you'll choose not to run, whatever. And the next board would fund the next spot, would vote on that next bond sale. So like I said, it's somewhat of a game, but it is relatively easy to figure out in the case of your master plan. So just to let you know, I've taken a stab at it. So looked at a different way, and this is the format you'll see in the next 3 slides, is we essentially have divvied up the bond sale into a increment 1, increment 2, increment 3, increment 4, same format you just saw, except that now we are looking at a numerical scale on the left. So now it actually has some numbers, and all this is the dollar amounts of measure T and U divided by 4. This is not exactly how it will go down, but it's close. And these sales will occur over certain years. So how most people approach this, and it's your program, not mine, how most people approach this is, and I told you at the very beginning, over a year ago, we were not going to talk about priorities. We were going to talk instead about practicalities in the way that we roll out projects. So how most people approach it is they sort of stack up the first thermometer and then stack up the last thermometer and let everything else in the middle happen in between. In other words, it's much easier for most boards, most districts, to determine the first things that they want to get done. And it's kind of easy to say, well, that's probably the last projects we would do, and then let everything in the middle happen where it fits to fit within the thermometers. So if you're ready, I'm going to show you a draft of your implementation plan. So as we fill up the thermometers, it looks something like this. This is increment 1. So increment 1, and you're going to see these colors pretty much match the diagrams that are in the site plans on your master plan. So that's should be easy to read now. I've converted it from those sort of grayish tones to colors you might recognize. Yellow, build something new; orange or red, renovate something; green or another color is something other, site improvements and grounds. This is the first increment. The first increment, at least from my standpoint of what I have heard from the district, is that one of the key projects, one of the promises yet to be kept, was what to do with Buyer. It was one of the most vocal things we heard in the entire year of planning, was to say, what are we going to do at Buyer, Jim? What are we going to do at Buyer? And so this looks at, can we fit the entire Buyer new community district center at Buyer, fit it within tranche 1, and still get other things done at all the other sites? And the answer is yes, we believe we can. The Buyer site would be the first construction, new construction, thus yellow. There would be an element of planning that goes on. You might remember this from our last meeting, in which I explained there was going to have to be a seed of planning in the first increment. Planning means drawing plans. Otherwise you can't do other projects if you don't start drawing plans. So you'll see a little bit of a slice of orange in there. That is the plans being started for San Ysidro Middle School's modernization. Why do I recommend that be done upfront? Because that is the gatekeeper to state matching money. And you should remember that from that last diagram from last time, in which I showed you get state matching funds, like you've recently gotten on the list for La Mirada and Smythe, by having DSA approved plans. So you need to have plans of the San Ysidro Middle School mod to qualify for that state funding. So you make that investment early on. And then the other 3, green, purple, and blue, you'll see this populate as we go through the implementation plan, is work at every single site. This is good for the district. These are very fast projects, and that playgrounds can be replaced was one of the key things we heard at every single site that we interviewed. It can be done very quickly, very simple DSA project. Boom, you're out there. Every site gets new playground equipment. Todd's going to talk in a little bit about his technology plan. He and I have been working together on it. So you make your first investment in technology, because unless you can get some of the backbone up, you can't do the next phases in technology. And you also make another investment in security. One of the other highly talked about projects at every single site was doing security improvements, whether it's an access control system or single point of entry or just simple changes in gates and fences. And that would occur. You'll notice, I hope you can see my cursor moving. If it says all, that means that's at every site. So right out the gate, you're doing improvements at every single site. You're making an investment in plans for San Ysidro Middle to acquire state funding, and you're literally completing the project at Bayer. That, planning, construction, the whole thing. And that project at Bayer, if you'll remember, includes 3 elements. It includes what we sort of call the district community center. It includes the new central kitchen. I'll talk about that in a minute, and includes an administrative annex. It's sort of a first stop for new students coming into the district. This is an enrollment center and the like. So don't focus too much on the numbers, but this is straight out of the master plan and the budgets and costs that have gone in there. So what do you do last? So if you're going to do things first, like I said, most people fill up the last column last, and it doesn't mean these are not important, but it's just an easier way of thinking about it. So the projects, these are all, again, this will be once the 2 in the middle populate, this is the entire master plan on one page. And so you can see the projects and why they might be last. Pretty simple to know, we're going to be doing HVAC, roofing, and technology throughout the entire course of the plan. That'll be happening every year, so you'll always see that on every column. But at the district office, as most districts would, they would put off some of the improvements at the district office to the end. In other words, put the money at the schools first, pretty common philosophy. And then we have some projects scattered at Willow, Ocean View Hills, and Vista later on. And most importantly is because, especially at Vista, these 2 things already exist. You recently made an investment in a PE building, it's a locker building there, and I don't think it's it's certainly not at the end of its life. So we're suggesting to wait, and it is in the master plan, to replace it with a permanent wing at a later time. So that's why you're seeing this. The Ocean View Hills wing replaces buildings you currently have. So again, same philosophy. The buildings are there right now. So we're saying, okay, just hang on, and that would happen a little later on. And then the middle, and this is the entire master plan, then populates pretty obviously. Again, the base of the pyramid is all these other site improvements, technology and furniture. I haven't talked too much about furniture, but the concept is, as each project completes, it's like buying a new house and moving old junky furniture in. You don't want to build a new building and then move old junky furniture in. So the idea is, as each new project comes online, you're going to make an investment in new furniture. You did that at Smythe and La Mirada to populate those buildings with new furniture instead of moving old furniture into them. So that's kind of that's what that base means. As I said, again, Todd's going to keep populating technology, dropping it in at every single increment throughout the district to stay current with current technology. And then this big investment at the top that you see in orange is the modernization of San Ysidro Middle. So remember I said in the beginning that I can't build half a building, but I can modernize a campus in increments, because literally San Ysidro Middle is a bunch of wings. They're separate buildings. And it really almost has to be done as separate wings, because you can't afford to shut the whole campus, send everybody home like it was another pandemic. You're going to have your kids there and the school is going to be running. So the San Ysidro Middle modernization almost surely will span 2 bond sales. Again, don't worry specifically about the dollars in any sale, but the concept still holds true that you would almost surely do San Ysidro Middle over two bond increments so that it's done in wings. And then the remaining projects is all associated with the movement of, and that's, I saved this to last, it's all associated with the movement of the CDC, which was the other major commitment, was to do something with the original existing portable CDC. And if you'll recall, the draft master plan had shown the concept of moving the CDC into space, available space at La Mirada. Now, thus the yellow in that it is new construction mixed with remodeled construction at La Mirada. And you'll remember that the east, I guess it's east, the east wing of La Mirada would get converted into the CDC along with an addition. Now, at the very end of the last meeting, one of you on the board mentioned, hey, Jim, what if we wanted to put the CDC at Bayer? And that was one of the only sort of comments we got on the draft master plan. This plan, this implementation plan, does not tear that asunder as an option. What it means is that that piece, that CDC piece, would not be at La Mirada. This entire element would become yellow, not yellow and orange. It would all be a new thing, and it would almost surely have to be built at Bayer. It's the only place we have to put it at sort of the south end of Bayer. So I don't want you to think I ignored that comment. Actually, that comment is built into this. If as we go through, I should say as you go through, if you chose to say, no, we don't want to do the thing at La Mirada, we want the CDC to be at Bayer, this implementation plan does not paint you into that corner. You would just gobble these two together and make that a new CDC at the Bayer site. Same expense, just done differently. And that would occur there. So that is literally on one snapshot, every project that's in your master plan. That's all of them. And they pretty much fit pretty nicely into the columns. Although I would say, even Marilyn and I, this took a while to get here. I'm hoping I made it look easy, but I'm telling you, it is a game, and getting all of these pieces to fit relatively neatly. We all know this is master planning. It's not going to fit exactly, but you have to start somewhere. This seemed like a pretty reasonable strategy for your implementation plan. That is essentially the presentation in a nutshell. I can, like I said, you could start over and start filling up the thermometers yourself, but this is how we did it. When I've done this in the past, I have actually done it on a board with boards, and we literally move the pieces around until you as a board come to a quorum, and it goes pretty easily. I've done it on a Saturday morning, believe it or not, with everybody in tennis shoes and t-shirts. But in the end, no matter how you do it, you can even move the columns around if you want. I think it'll lay out something similar to this. That's the implementation one. That's your whole bond program on one page. Questions?
Thank you, Mr. DiCamillo. Do we have any questions from our board? Mr. Gurmilan, Mr. Lopez?
None for me, thank you.
Mr. Gurmilan?
No, I just wanted to say this is really helpful. It really, I mean, just to visualize how things would work. So I appreciate this and all the hard work. It makes a lot of sense.
You're very welcome. I think this is the best way to show it. I've learned over time, this is the best way for people to get their head around it. And it will move over time. You have to understand, this is a trip across the country. Like I said, all you want to do is make sure you don't get too far off the path, because the less moves to get back on the path, the more you can stretch your bond dollars into the entire program.
Mr. DiCamillo, from my end, I'm very impressed with your implementation plan. And frankly, I can't think of anything wrong with it at all. Even I was the board member that asked about La Mirada. I guess, the one question I had, I'm just still perplexed as to why La Mirada being the new CDC. I just don't know why that was chosen. I mean, I'm fine with it if the rest of the board, agrees. And the way this implementation plan looks, it looks perfect to me. But I guess that was my question. Who thought of that idea of having La Mirada being the new CDC?
Well, I'll speak to it first, and then I'll let Marilyn and Dr. Potter maybe chime in. But it makes sense because if you look at the draft master plan I provided, there is a sort of an enrollment, or not really demographic, but a capacity study within it. And what it's showing you is that you actually have capacity at if you think of them as a combined cluster, they're literally about the two closest schools I've ever dealt with. You could almost throw a rock between Smythe and La Mirada. That you actually, on those two combined campuses, have the capacity to incorporate the CDC there. And unless there is some significant growth that will come out of, I don't know where, in the heart of the district, you actually have the capacity to do this there at the site. Now, we all know that Bayer isn't that far away either, so it's giving you some option versus sort of planting these seeds around the district and leaving other rooms empty behind you. This would completely fill La Mirada and Smythe back up to their original capacity by incorporating the CDC within there. You have the teaching stations, you have the available seats.
I see.
Yeah.
Now, where it originally came from, I don't actually know, but I did the study of it, and I proved to the district it works.
And we also have our preschool director, Miss Lorena Varela Reed, who's also invited to this meeting. I don't know if she would like to say a few words on this topic. Miss Reed? There you are. Oh, I think you're on mute, Miss Reed.
Hello, everybody. Good evening. I really like the way this implementation plan was shared with us today. As far as the buyer site and the La Mirada site, either site would work for a new child development center. I really like the La Mirada site because it's more in a neighborhood area. It's kind of out of the way of the traffic and all of that is then buyer. The street there is very, very busy. Then you have also the noise level of the train that goes by there. For safety purposes, and which is what I'm really focusing on, is I just feel that parents would be feel a little bit more comfortable dropping off their little ones in a neighborhood setting, and within the school grounds. I mean, that's a perfect area. And that's kind of what my feeling is. It's more of a safety issue. But either site, of course, would be wonderful.
Perfect. No, that's a good answer. Okay, well, that's it from my end. I have no further questions. But I want to thank you, Mr. DiCamillo, for this great presentation. Very impressed with your implementation plan.
You're welcome. I'm sure it'll change over time, but I think it's a very good start.
And it's also visually pleasing, to be honest with you. It identifies exactly the game plan in a way that, we can modify it accordingly, but at the same time, it's a good start. So very impressed. Thank you.
Thank you. And the hope is that as the staff brings projects to you throughout the course of the program, they will keep showing this slide. They will keep bringing it up and say, here's this project, here's where it fits in the implementation plan, and here's where it fits in our master plan goals. That's the idea of all of these things, so that the district can manipulate them, but they can always come back to the original document and go, yeah, I understand why we're doing this. The challenge most districts have is they get into this far enough, they can't remember where they started or where they're going. This will keep you on track. So thank you for it's intended to be easy to read.
Mr. DiCamillo.
Thank you, Mr. DiCamillo.
Mr. President, may I ask a quick question?
Of course, of course.
Thank you. Mr. DiCamillo and Chief Business Official Adriansen, when these columns are called increment 1, 2, 3, and 4, are those matched by any chance with issuances of the GO bonds?
Yes.
Marilyn, you or me?
Yes. This is a proposed incremental bond sales. So
Okay.
they're split into 4 potentially timeframe of bond sales and the construction projects.
Just to make it simple for the diagram. This will take a lot more detailed planning than this, but you got to start somewhere. So this is intended to be just a very easy to read diagram. As I've explained all along, there are other sources of funds that come in and support this along the way, but to do it in its simplest form, I think it gets the point across.
And Ms. Adriansen, last question. We did just issue Series 1, right?
Series A, yes.
Series A, so that would be increment 1.
Correct.
And remind me the total value of Series A that remains available, because some of it, I think we
Right.
did it
We paid
refunding.
off. Yes, we paid off
Uh-huh.
the 2017 COP certificates of participation in the first Series A for Measure T. We issued $15.8 million. And then Measure U, we issued $20 million. Currently, we have a balance of about $19.9 million in Measure U, Series A, which we can use for the first round of construction projects.
And so if I'm reading the chart right, thank you, Ms. Adriansen, it looks like this first increment one goes to 28 million of projects, but the balance we have after the paying off of the COPS is about 19.9 million.
Correct.
So would we have to pare down increment one projects?
Yes. Is
Yes,
that right?
yeah, yes and
Mr.? Uh-huh.
no, or develop another phase basically within it. That's why we split the buyer site into, it's really 3 projects in one. So
Okay.
that's one of the reasons why that's listed that way, because it could be, like I said, you can't build half a building, but if you're building a building that's coming in increments, you could. And then there are vehicles, financial vehicles, to move over and grab essentially money from the bucket next door. There are ways to do that your bond counsel and finance people will help you with. So yes.
Right.
And Ms. Adriansen,
Mhm.
for the board highlights next Friday, would you just let us know proposed years of GO bond issuances or sales? So if we were to match up these columns, we would have some sense of what years they might happen.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you so much, Dr. Potter. Do we have any other questions for Mr. DiCamillo? Hearing none, Mr. DiCamillo, this is a great presentation. Thank you so much.
You're very, very welcome.
Okay, we're going to move on to our second presentation.
We would like to welcome Tyree Dorwood from Best and Krieger Legal Counsel. He will present on the topics of school construction, procurement methods, and the second presentation, an overview of project labor agreements. Mr. Dorwood.
Thank you, Ms. Adriansen. President Martinez, Dr. Potter, board members, thanks for the opportunity tonight. I know Dr. Potter, when she and I were briefly discussing these topics, we tried to put together, or I've tried to put together kind of a really high level overview. Most of these topics can be examined in a lot more depth and certainly are going to start to come forward in front of the board as you get to all these projects and all the exciting things that Mr. DiCamillo has talked to you about in terms of projects. And so we're going to try to at least provide you some, basic information tonight. I, again, try to keep it very high level, but at any point in time, I am happy to go further down into the weeds if the board has any questions. Again, in a workshop format, we'll try to keep it as informal as possible and try to get any questions you have tonight answered as we move through, but also at least give you kind of an introductory look at all of the all of the decisions and options you may have as you start to get to the actual implementation of projects. And most importantly, how do you actually get the shovels in the ground and how do you actually get the buildings to come out of the ground? So with that being said, I'll dive right in. And like I said, please don't hesitate to stop me if there's a question you want to ask during. And then, of course, obviously happy to answer anything at the end as well or go off on to any other topic. So go ahead to the next slide, Miguel. So we're going to start with just kind of a really, really high level look at the statutory authorities that are out there for school districts with regard to any public works procurements of any public works projects. Clearly, that's what you're contemplating with your bond measure, school facilities projects that involve both state funding as well as local bond dollars. State funding process, I know Mr. DiCamillo has spoken about it a little bit. The state funding process actually makes you certify to 1,000,001 things in little tiny 8-point font on your state funding forms. And in those certifications, on behalf of your district, an appropriate representative is going to be signing, likely Dr. Potter or Ms. Adrianzen, that you've complied with all applicable laws, including all of these code sections that I'm going to mention tonight. And like I said, there'll be an 8-point font. So really, what the public contract code and the statutes that revolve around public procurement typically are focused on is ensuring that public agencies acquire goods, services, and public works construction in a fair and impartial manner that provides equal access to qualified bidders. What does that actually mean? Every agency has different statutory authorities. Every agency is a little bit different. K-12 school districts have specific sections of the public contract code that apply to public works construction and goods and services. That's the statute cited on this slide. That requires, as a baseline level of competitive bidding requirement, that for public works, if it's over $15,000, you will competitively bid that construction services contract and award it to the lowest responsible bidder. If it's goods, supplies, or services, the legislation gives an indexed amount for K-12 school districts. That indexed amount is currently at $96,700. It increases annually by the California CDE, Department of Education, and it goes up, roughly a couple $1,000s every year, depending on what CPI is. Goods, supplies, and services, just to kind of try to relate it to Mr. DiCamillo's presentation, to give you some practical examples. When you have those portions of your bond program where you might be doing IT, we have those portions of your bond program expenditures. We might be doing furniture. Those are different contracts than if you're building a building. And that's where the bid threshold will be different between one kind of procurement and another. These are the baseline level requirements of the code. There are exceptions to every rule, as I'm sure you've dealt with enough lawyers probably in your time that lawyers often talk to you about exceptions. But exceptions exist for a reason, and the general rule typically applies, which is what this slide is intended to address. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. So another important one to highlight for you is the professional services. The district and the board already probably has some experience with this. You've already hired some architects. You've already undertaken some planning activities. Those activities that are professional services are typically awarded via RFP or RFQ type process. Again, some level of competition is always advisable for architects and construction managers. There's the government code provision that's cited in this slide. The contracts themselves are awarded based on demonstrated competence and qualifications. Typically, that's the RFP or the response to the RFP that's deemed most advantageous scores the highest on your evaluation committee process. You're going to be dealing with a lot of professional services as you move forward with the bond program beyond what you've probably seen already. That may include CEQA consultants for environmental reviews. It's going to include DSA inspectors. It's going to include testing labs, specialty engineers, et cetera, et cetera. All of those are going to be professional services type procurements. They won't be awarded to the lowest responsible bidder, but you're likely going to do some competitive process for each of those prior to them coming to the board. Clearly, the other thing that's highlighted by Mr. DiCamillo's implementation plan is that you're going to be looking not just at near-term contracts, right? But you're going to be looking at further-term planning efforts in order to get projects in the pipeline and have them ready and frankly, shovel-ready at the appropriate time. You do have variables as far as how you will have your money in your pocket, as far as bond sales, state funding, and any other funding sources that might be available. These are an ongoing funding source you've got that is available for public facilities improvements as well. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So another thing that Dr. Potter and I, briefly talked about that I just want to highlight at the outset, which is important, I think, for the board to also bear in mind, is public works contracts for the construction, and this applies to some degree to the professional services as well, but this slide was mostly focused on the construction aspect, are highly regimented, and generally speaking, we'll talk a little bit of alternative delivery methods in a minute, but generally speaking, there's not much negotiation. The vendors, the bidders, are executing the district's contract. The district's contract is what is circulated to the marketplace, and the vendors either choose to participate in under the district's terms and conditions, or they choose not to participate. For construction, you are always going to have DSA approved plans and specifications. You've already talked about that with regard to your master planning. That's a baseline expectation. Certainly, you're going to have the possibility that you do design build or other alternative delivery methods we'll talk about in a minute, but you will always have DSA plans and specifications approved for every facilities project. For every public works contract, you're also obligated by law to have payment bonds in place. Payment bonds ensure that the workers, the subcontractors, the material providers of that public works project are paid. The payment bond exists for the benefit of those folks, the workers. The performance bond is the insurance policy that the district has that ensures performance of the contract. So that helps you finish the building if there's a default by the contractor. Two very different bonds, but important and critical for every single project, and of critical importance to ensure that your projects actually get finished once they're commenced. I think the other important thing to just try to relate it to a very practical example, payment bonds also are important, and the reason they exist is because it's public works, not private works. As you all are aware of, in the private environment, if a contractor is not paid, they get to lien your house if they perform work on your house. They do not get to do that in the public world. It's public property. It can't be liened, so they have by law the assurance of payment through the payment bond. All of your contracts will have insurance and standard insurance and standard indemnification in favor of the district. These are very typical and common terms. They will be in all of your construction contracts. There'll be appropriate termination rights in all of the contracts. Termination for convenience is a very important right for the district to have. Certainly, there are practical realities of any termination for convenience as far as how do you address it, what happens when it occurs, what fees are owed to the contractor at the time of termination. Convenience is very different than default. Termination for default, just another important to tie it back to the other concept. A termination for default is what gives you a right under the performance bond to go ahead and ensure completion of your project. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. One more important, aspect of all public works contracts is that they are also heavily regulated as it relates to the labor code and prevailing wage requirements and labor and working conditions. We'll talk about the PLA, community benefits agreements, and how they relate to these things later on. But the reality is that under the labor code, prevailing wage and DIR compliance is mandated for all public works projects, regardless of whether you have a PLA or whether you use any of the alternative delivery methods. So again, a baseline requirement for any public works construction contract that you're going to be entering into. And frankly, just so the board is also aware, prevailing wage actually attaches to services contracts if the scope of work that's being performed under that services contract is subject to prevailing wage. So examples of that are certain engineering contracts like land surveying, those kinds of things. DSA inspectors are actually subject to prevailing wage DIR requirements if they're performing anything that relates to the public works project. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. All right, so segueing from just kind of the overarching structure and the general high-level minimum terms, Dr. Potter wanted me to talk at least to introduce the concept of the construction delivery methods. And I think much like your contractors and the building analogy, all of these delivery methods are tools in any school district's toolbox of how you would build a project. All of these delivery methods can be successful All of them can face challenges depending on what the project is, how it's executed, and most importantly in all these, who is the vendor or contractor on the other side. So I think the point of emphasis that's important to talk about here that does also relate back to Mr. DiCamilo's presentation is, what is the school district really focused on, and what is every public agency focused on when they're doing construction projects? You're focused on delivering a project on time and on budget that meets your agency's, your school district's expectations for what you're delivering. And so as you look at these and you consider them different tools in your toolbox, all of them have certain circumstances that they may work better or worse than other circumstances. And every project that you undertake is going to be slightly different. Every school site is slightly different. Every school site may or may not have different scheduling issues, may or may not have different environmental issues, may or may not have different physical issues. Is it adjacent to a hillside? Is it adjacent to a busy street? Is it adjacent to some other factor that's going to impact your construction? So all of those are important things to think about as you decide which delivery method might or might not fit better for a specific project. I introduce the first one as traditional, generally the most common. That's what the lowest responsible bidder statutory citation from the previous slides. Under that delivery method, you are independently contracting with an architect of record. The architect of record prepares your plans and specifications. Once those plans and specifications are fully approved, DSA approved, then they are bid. That's the bid component of it to the construction marketplace. And the lowest responsible bidder is awarded the contract for building the school facilities project. That's what happens under Public Contract Code 20111 for any contract in excess of $15,000 right now. The alternative delivery methods are all variations on that traditional method, or that most common method, and all still have a DSA approved set of plan specifications, as well as a fully protective of the district construction contract component of it. We'll talk about each of these. I put the statutory authorities on this slide, but we'll go through design build, lease leaseback, and energy conservation services contracting. Let's go ahead and go on to the next slide, and we'll go through each one briefly. All right, so design build. Design build is a statutory authority that allows a school district, for any project that exceeds $1 million, to award a single contract that consists of both design and construction to a single design build entity, whereby design and construction is provided for the guaranteed maximum price that is referred to in there. This design build, like lease leaseback and energy conservation services, is a best value type selection process. So that means you're not obligated to award to the lowest bid. You are to decide what your best value selection criteria are, taking into account the whatever criteria you would like as regarding qualifications, experience, design minimums, schedule and scope issues, et cetera. I think the last point is important, and one I wanted to put on here because it applies to all alternative delivery methods. Unforeseen and unknown conditions that are beyond the ability of the design builder to anticipate at the time of contract are still going to remain a district responsibility. So oftentimes the words guaranteed maximum price, I think, will get thrown out to board members, and you'll hear those in an RFP, or you'll see those in an RFP. I just think it's important for the board to understand that doesn't cover every single unforeseen circumstance, and there is always the possibility that a contract has a change order or an amendment that potentially increases the the cost of the project. And that's something that clearly the board will be very cognizant of and be looking at very closely, because you could see, I could clearly see from your implementation plan, you have a lot of priorities and you have a lot of projects you would like to get to. So it's going to be critical that you are effectively managing the budget for each project and making sure that you get the most bang for your buck with every delivery method. And I think that's one more important point I didn't say on the previous slide that I would throw out there, is that all delivery methods should be also viewed from the lens that they have a starting contract value and they have a final contract value. Again, to deliver the project on time and on budget, what is the district most concerned with? The end project value. So every design bid build contract is typically going to have some change order rate. Every design build project may have owner requested changes that increase the budget. Appropriate planning throughout the process, working with your architects and your construction team, is always going to have appropriate contingencies, allowances, etc. Again, to try to make sure that your delivery method and your contracts ultimately get you to that end of that process on time and on budget. So let's go ahead and go to the next one. So Elise Leaseback is also a best value type award. The statute for Elise Leaseback has changed within the last few years. Elise Leaseback that was done, over the last 10, 15 years has changed into a much more formalized process. Most districts were doing RFPs before. Well, now it's statutorily mandated. There's a very clear statutory process for how a Elise Leaseback contract is procured. It requires a RFP type process with appropriate advertisement and publication, as well as a best value selection that is appropriately justified and established pursuant to the RFP. The structure is a little bit different because it does require the district to lease the construction site to the contractor in exchange for the facility. The contract documents will set forth all of those required construction and lease terms in accordance with the applicable code sections, as well as best practices. The leaseback process does allow you to bring on and hire a contractor early in the process, and allows you to potentially do pre-construction services, is what they're often referred to, which is where you try to marry up your construction contractor and your design team early on to try to achieve budget savings and things like that. So that's a component that you don't get in the typical design bid build process, because the contractor doesn't bid the contract until after the plans are done. The leaseback contractor can potentially be placed under contract earlier in the process and potentially help with those kinds of things. So in certain projects, you can see how pre-construction services might have a really, really big advantage. If it was a big new building and you had lots of potential value engineering opportunities and things, that might be of great help. If it's a paving or asphalt project, not necessarily likely to be a lot of opportunity for value engineering and constructability review. So that's Elise Leaseback in a nutshell. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. Energy Conservation Services is a separate statutory authority that does allow you to, again, utilize a best value type selection if this district can make specific energy conservation findings. This is a much narrower authority, and it only applies to these specific kinds of projects. Typically, these types of projects would have to be some sort of energy efficiency project, like solar is common. We've seen certain energy retrofit type contracts can be done under these. At the end, we talked about power purchase agreements, leases like that. Those can often also be done under energy conservation. But again, critical that the district be able to make the factual findings necessary to use this statutory authority in order to be able to do that. If you are to, and it is a project that you can do that, then you can have a contract that has design build and or design bid build type contract terms, just really depending on what it is the contract is actually going to contemplate. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So I guess we could take a quick pause here, President Martinez or Dr. Potter, if we want to take questions now, or do you want me to go ahead and go on to project labor agreements?
Yeah, no, at least from my end, I think we're good. I don't know if the rest of the board, do we have any questions for Mr. Dorward? You're up. Yeah, in this case, I think we should just finish the presentation.
Okay. All right, great. So project labor agreements. So what are project labor agreements? We'll talk a little bit about that. What are the advantages, disadvantages as reported by different agencies that have used them? I think the intro to this that I would say is that, Best and Krieger, we're a large statewide firm. We certainly have plenty of clients that use PLAs, and we certainly have clients that don't use PLAs. So it really is a policy decision by the board and the individual district as to whether they want to incorporate one. And certainly you probably have heard a little bit about these. There are certainly several agencies down in the South Bay, I know, that are using project labor agreements that we've also worked with. And our firm has certainly negotiated PLAs for a variety of different projects as well. So happy to answer any questions as we move through it. Again, without getting in the weeds, I'm going to try to stay above the weeds for now, since again this is just an intro project, but I'll try to at least cover the basics of what they are and what they might do to a public works project or a bond program. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. The statutory reference on the previous slide is the authority under which any public agency in California. That section of the Public Contract Code applies to all public agencies. These aren't just school districts that have project labor agreements. These are any public agency can consider implementing them. What are they? Under those code provisions, it's a policy decision that the public agency can make. What the document is itself is a pre-hire collective bargaining agreement that establishes the terms and conditions for employment and hiring and wages and benefits and other terms associated with the workforce that will be utilized on the projects or types of projects for which it applies to. The contract itself is a single contract that the public agency enters into with a union or a group of unions. Typically in San Diego County, that's a laundry list of all of the applicable unions. All of the unions would be asked to sign on to it, and all of the unions would agree to abide by its terms. And the nuts and bolts of that would be the specific wages, benefits, employment terms, hiring terms, types of projects, exclusions of projects that would be established for the district and negotiated between the district and the union representatives for your projects or sets of projects under the PLA. Another common component of PLAs are local hiring goals. They are established as goals for the scope of whatever the PLA is that's negotiated, and then it's of course tracked and reported back to the board as to how your projects and how your hiring program is working. I do think the other important thing to tie this back to that I talked about briefly at the outset is that the prevailing wage law requirements and all of the certified payroll records and all of those basic labor code requirements will still apply even under PLA. There will still be, prevailing wage law compliance and tracking of all of those things, but the PLA may layer on top additional goals and reporting requirements that are going to be tracked and utilized to track potentially local hiring is the easiest example to think of. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So I think I already basically covered point number one, but PLAs can be project specific. They can be cost and or time specific. All of that is negotiable in the school district and the bond program world. Oftentimes they are usually, to what I have typically seen, is they're either project specific, so they might apply to one very, very large project, or they might be bond program specific above a certain threshold. That's very, very common. I think that's very typical of the PLAs that your neighboring districts have. I think they all have slightly different thresholds, but again, the threshold is negotiable. The threshold is established by the board and negotiated with the applicable unions. The PLA itself typically includes very typical is the word I used on the slide. I was going to say another word would be standard provisions that are going to cover, no strike, no lockout agreements and procedures. They cover dispute resolution provisions amongst the different trade unions and crafts that might be applicable to a project as to who is going to assign workers and how workers will get assigned. Again, with the intent of the agreement being to ensure that workforce is a skilled and trained workforce available to the district, and that it's certainly available to the district on the schedule needed by the district in order to ultimately deliver the project. The last point on there is not as probably relevant as it was when I probably first gave some of these presentations. PLAs have become more and more common across the state. There were typically, originally they were a little more common in the Bay Area and the Los Angeles area. At this point in time, I think we've seen PLAs pretty much across the state. Very common now in San Diego County, obviously, and even in some areas of the Central Valley where there were very few PLAs 10 years ago. There certainly are PLAs now in a lot of places. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So pros and cons, would report to you here on the pros and cons that these are advantages and disadvantages that we've tried to be as factually accurate as we can on. Proponents will argue to a public agency one way, and opponents will argue another with regard to PLAs. So try to be very practical on these. What do? They provide, what are the advantages? You are providing uniform wage, benefit, overtime, working condition, work rules, work assignments, labor harmony, grievance dispute resolution provisions. All of that is what is set forth in a PLA. That means that there won't be any dispute with regard to those things in the contract. All contractors typically in a PLA are required to submit what's called a letter of assent or letter of acknowledgement, and that's each contractor or bidder written agreement that they will abide by the terms. And those terms will then apply throughout the life of their contracts, and that expectation is certainly set at the time of bid. So I think another important point just to mention here with regard to project labor agreements is certainly your project labor agreement, if you were to do one or more of them, they are going to be implemented on a bid by bid or a contract by contract basis. That will mean that all bidders will enter into or bid on those contracts with the expectation and with the understanding and knowledge of whatever those requirements might be for each such contract that it would apply to. So just important to know that it does have that relationship to the procurement process, because it will be not only established prior to the procurement process that it applies to, it'll certainly have to be discussed and incorporated into the procurement process. Let's go ahead and go to disadvantages. So the disadvantages that are typically referred to is what effect will it have on your bidding pool. It may discourage non-union contractors from bidding in your project. Again, the PLA itself and the code requires that they be non-discriminatory. So the PLA is not going to ban anybody from participating. It's not going to prohibit anybody from participating. It will have wage and benefit and employment requirements that may affect, who bids on a project or who doesn't bid on a project. So that's why, that point is in there. It could have that exclusionary effect to local contractors depending on what the threshold is. One way that issue has been addressed in PLAs that we have seen is you do have that issue of setting up specific exclusions. Those are negotiated into a PLA. Certain contracts can be excluded from applicability, PLA applicability, versus included. And if there's a need for small contracts as a typical type exception, a threshold could be higher or lower, depending on what the district plans. And that's a way to manage potential, local contractor participation if those contractors are not wanting to participate under a PLA. There's a worker hiring hall issue. Again, really a non-issue for existing union contractors. Could be a practical issue for non-union contractors who don't have experience hiring through the union hiring hall and or have their own workers that they would have to ensure are complying with the PLA requirements. Again, it is not, the terms and conditions in the PLA would not be exclusionary or prohibitory on anybody participating, but it would have a practical impact on how hiring is occurring on the job site. So that is really, I think, covers in a nutshell everything that I wanted to try to convey at a high level. All these topics are very, very detailed. There's a lot of detail in the weeds that the board, can get into. We certainly can come back at any point in time and discuss these things in more detail as it relates to individual projects or individual efforts by the district. But with that being said, I'd open it up to any questions on any of these topics and certainly PLAs that we just covered.
Thank you, Mr. Dorward. Do we have any questions from the board and from Dr. Potter as well?
I don't, but I thank you, Mr. Dorward, for the presentation. Very thorough. Can we get those slides if possible? It'd be nice to just go over them again. Oh, man.
Perfect. Mr. Lopez, Dr. Potter, any comments, thoughts, questions?
Not for me, thank you.
I have a couple questions for Mr. Dorward. Do we have a few minutes, Mr. President?
Of course, yes.
Thank you. Mr. Dorward, first, thank you so much for your detailed and thorough presentation. I appreciate it. And I'm sure that Ms. Adrianson will email out the presentation slides. I think some of them have already been emailed out, but we could send them all one more time for all presentations.
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Dorward, my first question has to do with your professional services procurement basics. And it talks about a construction manager. And so I wanted to know if you could explain the benefit of the district having a construction manager that serves as an owner's representative to the district, because in the past, we haven't always had an owner's representative. We may have had a firm that was building a construction project, like a modernization of a school, where they in and of themselves had a construction manager, but that construction manager was representing the agency that was doing the building rather than necessarily the district itself. So could you please explain the benefit of having an owner's representative construction manager?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, because I think I also sort of did fail to mention one thing as I was talking about delivery methods, which is the district will also always have to make decisions about projects based on its own existing in-house resources versus what it might want to outsource. And so I think Dr. Potter's question really goes to, when might you want to outsource certain services or have additional consultants? And construction management is clearly one of them. Construction management can take several different forms. You can hire a construction manager that works for the district as an independent consultant for a single project, for multiple projects. You can hire you can refer to them as a construction manager, and that generally sort of has one set of tasks associated with it. You can refer to them as an owner's representative as a professional consultant. You can refer to them as a project manager. Any of those are all fine, no matter how you would slice it. They would all be professional service providers under contract to the district to support the district and perform certain scopes of work for the district in support of your project or projects, depending on, whatever you put in their scope and whatever you negotiated into their fee. I think the good thing that about those as professional service providers is exactly that. The district gets to potentially look at what it needs, look at what its in-house resources are, and then decide, we need support with this and we need support with that. And and a construction manager can really provide almost an A to Z like list of services that goes almost right up to what the construction contractor provides. So you can really potentially make some choices with regard to that as to what you want them to do. Obviously, you want to be sure that you don't pay twice. You don't want to pay for the same service twice, but you will be able to, create a scope for a construction manager, project manager, depending on whatever your needs are. And those types of things are really potentially advantageous for particularly for small school districts like your district, where you don't have a ton of people in-house who can manage 8 different construction projects. And as Mr. DiCamilo's implementation plan shows, you might have a pretty good number of construction projects all going on at once at some point during your bond program. And if that's the case, you may need additional support for staff, and you may be able to hire one or more construction managers at that time. Have I your question, Dr. Potter?
Thank you, Mr. Dorward. Is it reasonable to say that an owner's representative construction manager would hold the construction contractor accountable to perform the full scope of work and to stay within budget?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Mr. Dorwood, under the Public Works contract basics, so thinking about the construction contract between the school district and a contractor, okay? Is it reasonable to say that you, as the district's attorney for the GO bond projects, would read and ensure that there are protective provisions in all construction contracts that would protect the district to be able to, if needed, terminate a contract and to address failure to perform?
Yet not only reasonable, it would be expected. Those would be very, very clear terms, like we talked about on this slide, and I think the one following it. We would recommend for all of these construction delivery methods use and development and use of a standard district form contract, and the standard form contract goes out with the procurement documents, and the expectation is that all of your partners, industry partners, be they design builders or LLB contractors even as well, are signing the district's form contract that include all of those provisions that, to your point, most importantly protect the district in the event of a worst case scenario.
Thank you. So your firm would help us make sure that those construction contracts are protective of the district?
Of course, absolutely.
Okay, my last question. In the design, build, construction, procurement methodology, there's this GMP, guaranteed maximum price. How does a GMP protect the district?
So the best way to think of it in a design build context, I think, is to view it as you have got a single contract to deliver X improvement, and you, in the contract, are transferring all the risk associated with the design and construction of that project to the design builder for the guaranteed maximum price. And so the expectation that the contract terms set out is that the design builder owns the responsibility of delivering that project for the guaranteed maximum price. And if that design builder makes a mistake in the design, that the design builder has the financial responsibility to correct it at no additional cost to the district. So I think that that's the way I would really try to view it, is it's a risk transfer contract term that you are intending to transfer that risk to the design builder, versus, by comparison, the design bid build method. If the architect makes a mistake in the plans under the design bid build method, you do potentially owe a change order to the construction contractor, but you have a remedy against the architect. But the construction contractor doesn't care about your remedy against the architect. The construction contractor is still entitled to the change order. So I think the easiest way to think of an example of that is if a design builder, if a construction contractor leaves out the doors on an architect leaves out the doors, doesn't design them into a project, that's an architect's mistake. But the bidder who bids on the plans without doors is entitled to a change order to add doors. The district's remedy is potentially against the architect for failure to design the doors. That's the difference between the traditional method and design build. In design build, the design builder would own the financial responsibility to ensure that doors got put into the project.
Thank you so much, Mr. Dorworth. I have no other questions. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Dr. Potter. Mr. Dorworth, great presentation, very thorough. I love it. I think more importantly, it gives us a good idea of the basics of not just PLAs, but the procurement basics as well. So just thank you from my end. No questions. And the board doesn't have any other questions. We're gonna move on to our next presentation.
So the last presentation for tonight will be presented by our Director of Education Technology, Mr. Todd Lewis. He will present the proposed updated district technology plan, which is a timeframe of July 2021 through June 2024. Mr. Lewis?
Good evening, everybody. Let me get my screen shared here. And then, let's see. Can everybody see my shared screen? The plan?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So good evening, everybody, Dr. Potter and board members and those attending tonight. I'm here to present an overview of the technology plan, which is about a 22 or 23 page document. This plan outlines the technology for the next few years of the district. So the lifespan of this technology plan is from July 2021 through June 2024 and builds upon the previous tech plan. I believe it was 2016 through 2019. The previous tech plan was built and written by a group of teachers, principals, and district office staff that represented each school site. And this first slide talks about some of their goals compared to where they were then, where they are now. And I just wanted to show an emphasis that we're trying to continue on with previous work. One of the things they talked about a lot in the previous plan was one-to-one Chromebook initiative, where every student has a Chromebook. Back then, 4, 5, 6 years ago, a lot of students did have Chromebooks, but we were not to that level. Some of the devices aged over time, of course. And as we get into the new technology plan, recently we have achieved the one-to-one, so we have enough Chromebooks for each student to have one that wants one. And the ongoing part is more of a recycling plan of not just buying Chromebooks in a big lump the last 2 years, but to continue to buy some over time. So in 3 or 4 or 5 years, we don't have a lot that need to be replaced. And that's kind of the emphasis of this whole plan is a plan to continue moving forward at bits and pieces, slower steps, and having big ups and downs where we have new equipment, we have very old equipment, we have new equipment, just to keep things flowing. It helps the financial part as well. One of the other things that the 2016 tech plan talked about was bandwidth increase. The past 4 years, we've made great strides in bandwidth increases. We do have one last step that's kind of being held up a little bit due to an obsolete or older piece of equipment, but I'm hoping that'll be completed this summer. Google was also talked about a lot in the 2016 plan. Some students had accounts, some didn't. We've achieved that. As everybody knows, I believe all students and staff have accounts. One of the other things they talked about a lot in the previous plan is replacing obsolete equipment. We still do have a lot of obsolete equipment in the classrooms, such as smartboards and sound systems. So this plan kind of piggybacks or moves in the way of replacing such equipment. So we have manageable and good working equipment to support teaching and educating our students. Some of the goals of this plan also tie into the previous plan. There was discussion of professional development, which we know is very important. There is a little bit of an area in there that does talk about ongoing professional development. Students learning about the ethical use of technology, which ties into some of our board policies and acceptable use policies. I'm sure there's other areas of professional development. There is a whole section that talks about suggested trainings. Another big part of this plan, which I already mentioned, is about replacing older equipment and getting in a cycle of continuously buying equipment, or like a 5-year plan or something like that of replacing equipment. Obviously, smart boards don't need to be replaced every year, but Chromebooks we can buy slowly, workstations we can buy so many a year, as well as network infrastructure. One of the other things the plan talks about, and is a plan for the summer, is to migrate Synergy offsite. Synergy is our student information system. It's getting on older equipment and really needs a major overhaul or update. The vendor no longer supports a single school site like us hosting it. So we had a couple options we looked at, and I believe hopefully with the approval, the manufacturer will be hosting it for us. EduPoint, they created the product. They'll be hosting and managing the servers, doing backups, providing support. The nice thing about that is it's not a huge jump in costs. There's costs that we already have, and it is a little bit more, but it does incorporate many of the courses we have, including our license, which we have in perpetuality. So we don't have to buy Synergy again. We pay for like yearly updates, phone support, and maintenance. And the other piece is phone system, replacing the phone system. That's about a 10-year-old system. When I go into more details later in the presentation about that. Chromebooks and laptops. It's exciting to say we replaced a lot of Chromebooks and laptops in the past year. I do have the numbers in the tech plan, but it was over 200 laptops, I believe, we provided teachers and staff. I believe that every teacher and staff that wanted a laptop has one at this point. And the same thing with Chromebooks. We purchased a lot of Chromebooks and got a lot of them through grants, thousands actually. And over time, we were able to start replacing the older end-of-life ones. To try to start a cycle of this, I believe we should maybe purchase a few laptops each year, maybe something along the line of 30. That way we keep replacing and replenishing those that break, or end of life, or die. This way we have a constant stream or flow of Chromebooks or laptops. And the same thing with Chromebooks. We do have a fair amount in stock right now. So it's possible that for the 2021-2022 year, we could reduce this number. But since we've never really had a one-to-one initiative, never really had a cycle of Chromebooks, we're trying to estimate need. So we estimate probably a Chromebook would last about 3.5 years based on how it's cared for, manufacturer's end of life, which is probably 5 to 6 years, power cords and things like that. So this starts the cycle of replacing Chromebooks. As we get into the year, each year, we'll probably have a better idea how many we actually need. Like I said, right now we have enough, but we do have a lot of end-of-life Chromebooks still out there that we want to replace, and we are getting Chromebooks damaged that we have to replace. So this touches on those numbers. The estimate would be 600 Chromebooks at the cost of $211,800 for this year, 1,000 Chromebooks the following year, and 1,400 Chromebooks the year after. A lot of this will depend again on how many Chromebooks we go through, because we do have enough right now for everybody. It's just we have to recycle some of the old ones, how they're cared for, if we get a lot more damaged, things like that. But that's what these numbers touch base on, is trying to start that cycle as we get into 4 and 5 years away. Same thing with classroom equipment. One of the things we've struggled with the last few years is classroom equipment, especially the audio video systems. The problem with the systems that basically were installed about 10 or so years ago, same thing with the smart board. Those smart boards are no longer created or made, but they have been working pretty steadily. But the sound systems that are built into them or part of the room have been breaking down over time. This plan allows us to replace those devices. The idea is our computers in the classroom are probably have about 4 years, 3.5 to 4 years of use. So we want to start cycling those as we get to 5 and 6 years. So we would buy some teacher computers every year to replace the old, so we don't have to try to do 2,000 all at one shot, which is probably impossible, with the shorter summers and stuff. It also talks about replacing the smart boards with large screen LED smart boards. the sound systems with a soundbar type of system, which is cost effective. It includes mics that can be in it. And the nice thing about that is it can be interchanged pretty quickly. In other words, our current system is more built into the walls. We can't really do a lot with it. Now we're struggling. This provides a sound bar that can easily, it's modular. It can be pulled out, can be put back a new one in and replaced. We have purchased some document cameras and printers and projectors over time. There are still a fair amount of those that need to be replaced, so it takes into account those. And of course, as we get into LED smart boards, we can move away from projectors that would no longer be needed. So these numbers touch base on that. Again, these numbers can change dramatically depending on when we start buying, the costs, also the size of the LED smart board, which is dramatic, going from 75 inches to 85 inches, a dramatic jump there. So there can be some savings in there if we go with a 75 inch. The other thing with the classroom equipment is it'll require some rewiring. We're also struggling with rewiring because a lot of the computers we have has a specific, it's called DP port. The walls have VGA cabling, and the new smart boards have HDMI cables. So you're talking all these type of adapters. So in this project includes the rewiring of the classroom to HDMI cables. So it's more simpler, a lot less cluster of wires and cables. We can more effectively fix things quickly resolve issues, and more up to date. The other cost that would go away over time would be projector bulbs. As we go to smart boards, we would need projector bulbs. Another topic that ties very similarly into the last one is labs, library, and office hardware. Office computers still have fairly old computers. We'd like to replace them with new Windows computers. Labs are set up very similar to the classrooms with smart boards that are aging and no longer produced. Sound systems that are built into the wall and ceilings that need to be replaced. And the library has either a lab or something similar. One of the things we are looking at the lab, it's probably an optional or it's something to discuss. It could be a cost savings. Instead of doing Windows computers in the labs, is doing a Chromebox. A Chromebox is almost like a computer, but it has a monitor and keyboard. So there is a significant savings there. It's just something that can be discussed, but it gives the student and user an experience just like the Chromebook. They walk up, they log in with their Google account instead of having a Windows computer and then have to open Chrome, have to log into Chrome. It just provides a more seamless, but that's something that can be discussed site by site. I mentioned it to a few people, and a few people seem very excited about it, but of course that's for later discussion. Network infrastructure. Over time, like other equipment, the network infrastructure like firewalls, switches, servers, and data storage need to be replaced. Again, I always kind of think about it like a 5-year plan for a lot of that stuff, where network switches can probably last longer. Servers are basically a Windows computer or something similar, so they need to be replaced. But this gets into the replacement of those equipment. And again, these are estimates. We really need to get like finalized bids to actually determine the exact cost. But the nice thing about network infrastructure is the devices generally will qualify for E-rate depending on where they are. We have to work with our E-rate consultant to go through that process. Items at the district office may be partially or fully covered depending on their service. If they provide internet for schools, where the hardware at the school sites will most likely be fully covered, so they would get the whole 85% off. So these numbers dramatically drop when we start talking 85% off of them. But we do need to start cycling our network equipment. We have been buying some switches through E-rate. But one of the things I think would be nice to at least to start this year at minimum would be to replace the core switches which connect the schools together. They're quite older. They use different power connections or 220 power connections, and kind of stopping us from doing some other projects such as getting on battery backups. It's one of the last things and such. But we do need to get a recycling plan. The nice thing about network equipment, generally the switches and stuff can last longer. The phone system again is getting older. We need to start looking at replacing that, or at least suggest that we look at replacing that. This along with the core switches would be two of the projects that we would suggest being looked at first. Just because it's aging, we've had some issues with it. We've replaced a couple of things, but it's we want to resolve issues, we want to upgrade before we have any other issues. Now, again, this is just an estimated cost. Again, we need to have probably a bid or something along that line happen to determine the cost. I know licensing can be expensive. There is possibility of saving some money as far as keeping the phones that we have in place, but being that they're older, there might be compatibility issues. So the classroom phones and things like that, it would probably be better to update them, or at least in some type of cycle, even if we don't do it all at once, if they're compatible with the new phone system. Because they too can start having issues over years. We haven't seen a lot of problems with those, but there could be a compatibility issue with new software working with old phones. And that's all in here. The second and third year is just an estimate of like warranty for SmartNet. We'd have to get quotes on that, but that gives us access to, if we did through Cisco, phone support, and also if things die, we can replace them. But that's something else we'd like to look at. There are a number of other projects in this plan. The technology plan goes into things in more detail. One part is the migration of Synergy. Most of that is a yearly reoccurring cost. There is, I think, a $4,500 cost to migrate it, but there's not a huge, most of those are the reoccurring costs. So it's not that entire cost to migrate it. It's just a small overhead of migrating. We really need to look at, we feel that Synergy needs to be migrated to another vendor because the EduPoint no longer supports our small school district like us hosting it. So we have to move it off-site, and it's getting on aging equipment and operating systems and stuff. So we want to make sure it's safe and secure and for the future. Various reoccurring costs are just in general costs, like renewing our antivirus software subscription, technical support contracts. Our Destiny library system has a yearly contractual cost. There are some other costs in there as well. So that's kind of a reoccurring cost. And I know these numbers are high. And of course, the tech plan goes into it in detail to break out everything so you can look at it in detail and see what each cost is. The overall projected technology plan. So this is a 3-year plan. It was built upon the previous plan. We probably could string things out a little bit longer to 5 years, and that would give us some more time to implement things and maybe flow better with the replacement of technology. So generally, I figure a computer lasts about 5 years if it's taken care of, and at that point, the operating system becomes maybe obsolete or the hard drive slows down. So we can move this to a 5-year plan if the district would like to do that, some slight changes. But and again, I talk about in this slide, I estimated if we could get everything E-rated in the network portion, that was that network slide, we could save about $228,000. It probably won't be all of that. It'll probably be a portion of that, but there is savings there as well. So as we take a look at all this together, the estimate is about $8.7 million. There is some of that is, a lot of it is classroom hardware. We do have learning walls, depending on the size of the computer, the size of the smart board we want to fit in there. They might need to be reworked, rewiring things and such. But basically, this plan takes us over the next 3 years from older equipment to newer equipment, pretty much across the board. Some of it, like the phone system and maybe the core switches that connect schools and the audio video systems in the classrooms, really needed. We're struggling to support that. So that's the end of the presentation. The tech plan is kind of supplemental, or this is supplemental to the tech plan. It goes into details, but I'm happy to take any questions and try to answer any that you have.
Thanks, Todd. Great presentation, by the way. But
Thank you.
do we have any questions from the board or Dr. Potter?
Not for me.
Not for me.
I don't have any questions, Todd, but I have to say that so far, you're always fabulous, Todd. But this presentation identifies not just, a game plan, but also the costs and a timeline, which for me is perfect because it's extraordinarily detailed. So I just want to applaud you for your presentation, and I think we're good to go. I love it. So I just want to thank you, Todd, for doing this and presenting to us.
Oh, glad to do so. The IT department wants to move forward with new technologies. It'll make the teachers and staff happy. I think it'll make everybody's job a little easier, and it'll also let us be more efficient rather than fixing wires that have kind of, soldering wires and stuff. We get into looking at the bigger picture with new technology, especially with the whole pandemic and video streaming and Chromebooks and all that. So we're excited too.
And I just want to comment that I agree with you that our Cisco phone system needs to go. That, that's one of the first things. So I just wholeheartedly agree with your comment on that, because it is, I do believe it's out of sight, out of it's beyond its life cycle. So, Dr. Potter.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Lewis, first and foremost, the last few years, I have to say, with very little funding, you and your team has done a remarkable job with our technology infrastructure and also devices and hardware in our school district. And particularly this last year with the COVID pandemic, the rapid pivot of your team procuring the Chromebook devices for all of our students so that we would be one of the districts that, while the pandemic hit, we had 85% of our students that didn't have either a device or internet. And by fall, the first few weeks of this school year, into the first few weeks of this school year, 100% of our students had access to a device and internet. So I just want to say thank you and applaud you on behalf of the district for you and your team achieving that goal. It's truly remarkable. And from an equity lens, it's really important for our district and for our students. With regards to the final slide, and I will ask later of Ms. Adrianson, if you might work with Ms. Adrianson and Mr. DiCamillo, that number, it's quite high. So I know that I asked for a wish list and all the things we need to do. I really appreciate your offer of a potential transitioning from a 3-year plan to a 5-year plan. It might line up better with the issuances of our GEO bond series. So what we might want to do is have Ms. Adrianson take a look at the years that the GEO bonds issue, and that last implementation slide that Mr. DiCamillo provided, his proposed implementation plan slide, and you could see the amounts that he appears to be recommending under each of the columns that he had there, or the increments 1, 2, 3, and 4, and to see if we might be able to take the technology plan and line it up with those increments for technology. So if you wouldn't mind, and I know that you've been working so hard on this plan, and I want to say thank you so much, especially for valuing what the teachers and the staff had hoped for in the last technology plan, and committing to continuing their wish list into the future. So not only looking at the infrastructure needs of the district, but also the hardware and software needs of the district as well. So Ms. Adrianson, did you want to partner with anything I've shared in terms of guidance moving forward? Because I know we're coming into this June 24th board meeting. I want to make sure everything lines up.
Yes, we will do that. Todd, Mr. DiCamillo, and myself, we will work through the implementation plan. We did discuss it a little bit this week. So that is the goal.
Thank you so much. And Mr. Lewis, your vision of technology in our district, thank you for aiming high and for really going after the equity of access to technology for our students in our district. Thank you.
Yep, glad to help.
Okay, so on that note, we finished our 3 presentations, and I believe we're at number 7, which is adjournment. Do I have a motion to adjourn our meeting at 6:43 p.m.?
So moved.
Second.
Great, we have a motion by Mr. Gurbilan, a second by Mr. Lopez. Any further discussion? Hearing none, Dr. Potter, can you lead us in a roll call vote to adjourn?
Thank you, Mr. President. Calling for the adjournment roll call vote, beginning with Board Member Humberto Gurbilan,
Aye.
Board Vice President Rudy Lopez,
Aye.
and Board President Antonio Martinez.
Yes.
Mr. President, the vote passes 3-0.
Thank you. And on that note, I want to thank everyone for joining us here tonight. Thank you for all our presenters. And we will be adjourning at 6:43 p.m. Thanks, everyone, for joining us.